Hello. With me today is Dr. Mary Cunningham, who's an expert on Eastern Orthodox theology. Everyone associates orthodoxy with icons, but of course icons have a rather troubled history in the history of Christianity, and there have also been periods of iconoclasm, when icons were completely rejected. Mary, can you tell us something about iconoclasm?
Yes. I wanted to focus especially on a period during Byzantine history when icons were actually banned, and probably many were removed and destroyed from the churches. This was from the early 8th century to the middle of the 9th century, when a series of emperors decided to take an iconoclast policy with regard to the church. They were, of course, inspired by the commandment, the second commandment in Exodus 24, which says, "Thou shalt not create graven images," and interpreting that literally, as possibly the earliest Christians had done, although there is debate about how literally that commandment had been taken by early Christians and by Jews. But if you interpret it literally, it does seem to suggest that you should have no religious art. You should make no images of anything living on earth, in heaven, or in the sea. So they decided to institute a policy, thus reversing a growing trend in which icons had been painted and increasingly used by Christian worshippers and used in church. It includes both the panels that we know of, painted icons that you see in Orthodox churches that are portable, but also the decoration of churches by mosaic or fresco, the wall paintings, every kind of pictorial representation that you might have in church was suddenly banned. Now this resulted in controversy, in discussions and theological dialogue, and we get some very interesting discussions about the role of images in Christian worship emerging from this period. And eventually iconoclasm was overturned in 843. This is called the Triumph of Orthodoxy in the Orthodox Church, and it's celebrated every year at the beginning of Lent, when icons were restored. And the justification is enshrined in a whole set of ideas which is really known as the Theology of Images, the justification of icons and of pictorial representations, on a number of different grounds. These arguments were developed by theologians like John of Damascus, who lived in the early 8th century, Theodore of Studios, who lived in the early 9th, and a patriarch called Nicephorus, who lived in the same period, the early 9th century. Unfortunately, the writings of the iconoclasts don't survive, so we have very little idea of what kind of theological justification they produced, although we get a sense of what they were saying on the basis of these writings that developed against them and against their arguments.
Taking the arguments that were formulated against the iconoclasts, how does that produce a theory of images that is at one hand allowing images to be used in the church and at the same time avoiding the idea that one can depict God?
Well, there are a number of different arguments on different levels. I would say the whole discussion began simply with the question of idolatry and the production, of course, of this commandment, the second commandment. How do you answer that problem? And John of Damascus answers it by saying, well, God himself overturned that commandment. He then commanded Moses to make the tabernacle and to decorate it with cherubim who sit over the tabernacle. And he gives all sorts of examples from the Old Testament of things that God commanded the Israelites to make. And so he's saying we should interpret this with some discretion. God clearly meant certain types of images can be made and should be used to glorify God. Then there are the arguments that have to do with what an image is. And John of Damascus also tackles this one. It's quite clear from what he says that the iconoclasts probably had an idea about images which relates them very closely to what they are depicting. So they actually thought if you create an image of something, you are showing that thing or person in the image in its substance. And that is blasphemous. Of course, God cannot be depicted in a material thing. But John begins by saying an image is not the same as its prototype. He produces examples of many different kinds of images and says there are many different levels of images. The things that foreshadow other things, the way that man is an image of God, according to Genesis 1:26. There are all these different kinds of images which show that an image is not the same as its prototype. He's basically using some Neoplatonic theory here, which shows that an image is just a reflection. Then we get into the Christological arguments, which are to do specifically with whether we can depict Jesus Christ, who is both God and man. Now, the iconoclasts appear to have said, if you try to do that, you're guilty of blasphemy because you are attempting to portray God who is unseeable, who is divine, and who has no place in matter. And so the iconoclasts, John then says, are guilty of monophysitism. He said that they are confusing the fact that Christ is in two natures, that in his incarnation we are given permission because of Christ's incarnation to portray him as the incarnate God-man. And that he goes further to say if we did not create images of Christ, we would be denying the incarnation, in fact.
There's a curious parallel in that the Iconoclast Crisis, when we hear that word, we usually think of the period in the East that you were describing. But of course, in the West, it's in the 16th century that there's an Iconoclast crisis. And all the brightly coloured medieval statuary is pulled down. Often if you look at a medieval cathedral today, you can still see the empty niche where once a beautifully coloured statue was. And of course, Christians today are always, in the West, there is the debate, should you have a very elaborate, very colourful liturgy? Is there room for lots of imagery, or should it be utterly plain? And then again, we have the reality that it's a byword of our culture that we live in a visual age, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. In a sense, is it fair to say that the Iconoclast crisis is okay, it's a real period in the history of Eastern Christianity, just as there's an Iconoclast crisis in the history of Western Christianity, but really, in a sense, it reminds us of that there's a fundamental tension. God, the infinite, beyond all thought, and yet we as human beings need reflections, need images, need to interact with that which we can see. In a way, what you're saying to us is it's raising something very one of the fundamental tensions.
Yes, I think it is to do with a very fundamental tension, and I think the theologians of this period in the Byzantine Empire perceived that and saw that it was partly about the extent to which God manifests himself in the material world, in his creation, and to say that we can and we need to arrive at our apprehension of God by means of physical things and material things. One of the things that the iconophile, or those who loved icons, accused the iconoclasts of was of being Manichees, or of being dualists, of denying the fact that God can be present and transfigure the material world. And that was a very important result that is also expressed very strongly in the Theology of Images, that God gives permission, if you like, manifests himself in the incarnate Christ, and also in all those things in different degrees. Of course, there are different ranks of holiness, or of the extent to which divinity can be infused in things, and one should never confuse a painted icon with the real transcendent God. Of course not. But it is a window into that world, and that we can reach some kind of apprehension of the divine by means of and with the help of material objects is one of the things that was achieved in that discussion.
Mary, for bringing this whole area into our discussion, thank you.
Thank you.